Hey, everybody. Welcome back to the podcast. This is the BannedBooks podcast, episode 66. And we are your host, as always, Christopher Gillespie.
Chillin' willin'. Maxing. Relaxing.
Very maxed. Very
I'm totally relaxed.
Today. Gillespie's so far back in his chair right now, you can't see it, but he's very, very far back. And I am John of Riley. And the nootropics hit me about 4:45 this morning, and I'm still flying. So
yeah, we're like the polar opposite at the moment.
We really are. My thoughts are like nuclear reactions, and Gillespie's just pushed back in his chair with his hand behind his head. So we'll see how this goes today.
It's summer.
But we're going to finish up this episode, at least at the beginning of this episode, reading St. John of Damascus's critique of Islam, and then jump into, as we said in the last episode, Arius and the writings of Arius, and also because it was mentioned in the last episode, following our reading of Arius, we'll jump into Nestorius and the Nestorians. And that way, too, hopefully, you will have the groundwork for how Muhammad formulated what came to be known as the Islamic or Muslim religion. Because, as we said in the last podcast,
of
Aphrodite worship,
yeah,
Arian heresy, Nestorian monks' teachings, so forth and so on.
Mm-hmm.
And so in the last episode, we wrapped up in reading about on women. And rather than just leave this part and go on to the Arians, I really wanted to cover the camel of God. So we're going to. So John of Damascus continues his critique of Islam by writing, there is the book, The Camel of God.
Not in the Quran, by the way.
Not in the Quran. About this camel, he says that there was a camel from God, and that she drank the whole river and could not pass through two mountains because there was not room enough. It is harder for a camel to pass between two mountains after having drunk a river of water than it is for a righteous man. No, wait, that's a different one.
It's a pretty bloated camel.
That's a pretty bloated camel. There were people in that place, he says, and they used to drink the water on one day while the camel would drink it on the next. Moreover, by drinking the water, she furnished them with nourishment, because she supplied them with milk instead of water. Then, because these men were evil, they rose up, he says, and killed the camel. However, she had an offspring, a little camel, which he says, when the mother had been done away with, called upon God, and God took it to himself. And then we say to them, where did that camel come from? And they say that it was from God. And then we say, was there another camel coupled with this one? And they say no. Then how, we say, was it begotten? For we see that your camel is without father, and without mother, and without genealogy, and that the one that begot it suffered evil. Neither is it evident who bred her. And also this little camel was taken up. So why did not your prophet, with whom, according to what you say, God spoke, find out about the camel, where it grazed and who got milk by milking it? Or did she possibly, like her mother, meet with evil people and get destroyed? Or did she enter into paradise before you, so that you might have the river of milk that you so foolishly talk about? For you say that you have 3 rivers flowing in paradise, one of water, one of wine, one of milk. If your forerunner, the camel, is outside of paradise, it is obvious that she has dried up from hunger and thirst, or that others have the benefit of her milk. And so your prophet is boasting idly of having conversed with God, because God did not reveal to him the mystery of the camel. But if she is in paradise, she is drinking water still, and you, for lack of water, will dry up in the midst of the paradise of delight. And if, there being no water, because the camel will have drunk it all up, you thirst for wine from the river of wine that is flowing by, you will become intoxicated from drinking pure wine and collapse under the influence of the strong drink and fall asleep. Then, suffering from a heavy head after sleeping and being sick from the wine, you will miss the pleasures of paradise. How then did it not enter into the mind of your prophet that this might happen to you in the paradise of delight? He never had any of what the camel is leading to now, yet you did not even ask him when he held forth to you with his dreams on the subject of the 3 rivers. We plainly assure you that this wonderful camel of yours has preceded you into the souls of asses, where you too, like beasts, are destined to go. And there is the exterior darkness and everlasting punishment, roaring fire, sleepless worms, and hellish demons.
John's pretty intense.
Right?
And this is I guess what we would call an anecdotal story. It's not extant. It wasn't included in the Quran, but at least at the time of John, it was around. And John picks up on it because this vision of Muhammad, it's kind of crazy.
It's a little wibbly wobbly.
It is. I like the idea that without the milk of the camel, you don't have your hangover cure from the river of wine.
Practical and spiritual.
You obviously need water, but yeah, I mean, if this camel drank all the water, and now you don't have water, and the only thing you're left with is wine because you killed the camel, your story is kind of crazy. I'm not even exactly sure what the point is.
I was going to say, I wonder if I'm sure someone's written a doctoral thesis on this one paragraph.
The story of the camel of God.
So again, John writes in the book, The Table. Muhammad says that the Christ asked God for a table and that it was given him. For God, he says, said to him, I have given to thee and thine an incorruptible table. And again in the book of the Heifer, he says some other stupid and ridiculous things.
It's one way of winning a theological argument. Yeah.
No, really, tell us what you think. Don't hold back, John. In the book, The Heifer, he says some other stupid and ridiculous things, which, because of their great number, I think must be passed over. Yeah. I'm sorry.
Just skip it. Yeah.
It's just, there's this other book, but it's stupid, so let's just skip it. But I will include it.
Surah 2, by the way.
There you go. So you can actually go read this here for yourself. He made it a law that they be circumcised, and the women too. And he ordered them not to keep the Sabbath and not to be baptized.
Ridiculous.
Which is still practiced to this day.
Mm-hmm.
This is a big controversy in Europe and Canada, the United States, with Muslim immigrant populations who still practice genital mutilation, female circumcision.
Yeah, I mean that's what like World Health Organization calls it, which
right.
is a pretty intense indictment against a religious practice.
Right. There's no purpose whatsoever for genital mutilation of young women for female circumcision. There's none.
Well,
there's
except
no
for,
benefit to it whatsoever.
Like a repressive.
It's exactly what it is. It cuts off all the nerve endings.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Exactly. Because it would be a sin if you actually enjoyed procreation.
Yeah.
Yeah, right. So women have to be circumcised because God said so. Don't have to keep the Sabbath because God said so. You don't need to be baptized because God said so. In a dream to Muhammad. And it really wasn't God. It was the angel of light.
I had a vision.
I
like the idea of the table that, Jesus is a carpenter, right? Or his carpenter's son anyway. But he asked for God for a table that isn't going to fall apart because maybe he just got bored with making tables. I don't know. I mean, that seems to be the argument. It's like,
right.
Yeah, okay.
Jesus doesn't make tables. He just orders them.
From heaven. It's like,
right.
Yeah, divine Amazon.
And then John wraps up with this final statement. While he ordered them to eat some of the things forbidden by the law, he ordered them to abstain from others. He furthermore absolutely forbade the drinking of wine.
Which is probably then why the camel story falls out of out of use.
Right.
Since why would there be a river of wine if we can't actually drink it?
Right, exactly. So that there in a nutshell is just John of Damascus' critique of Islam, found in the Fount of Knowledge, Part 2, entitled Heresies and Epitome, How They Began and Whence They Drew Their Origin.
Yeah.
Or just heresies.
Go back and listen to episode 64, 65. Those two, I think you get John's stronger arguments.
Yeah, by the end, he's kind of just winding up with, that's stupid,
yeah,
this
by
is
the way,
dumb,
yeah.
Let's skip over it.
We're just going to we'll just drop some insults at the end here just to, amplify? It's almost like curse words or something.
Well, you'll see the progression is that John attacks Muhammad, he attacks his teachings primarily in relation to Christ and the Bible. Mm-hmm. And then out of that attacks these, what we would call vocational practices or vocational matters. Drinking, circumcision, obeying or not obeying the Sabbath, these kinds of things.
Right.
And so basically saying you don't believe that Jesus is the Christ. You play fast and loose with both Old and New Testaments. You claim the prophets, but don't quote the prophets because you can't. And therefore, the things that you say about vocation are nonsensical and stupid.
Yeah, and by the way, you do have some pretty crazy stories that don't seem to make any sense.
Right. That must have been one heck of a long sleep to come out of it with these many visions and these many directives from God.
Yeah, indeed.
So we're going to jump into now Arius, one of the more, I guess, famous heretics in church history. If he wasn't, we still wouldn't be talking about him 2,000 years later, almost 2,000 years later. But this goes into, as we said, the foundations of Islam and many heretical Christian sects over the years. And I think we noted at the end of the last episode, Arianism is essentially American religion, American Christianity. But just American religion in general, particularly Christianity, because of what Arius says about Jesus.
Right, and you can diagnostically see this in American Christianity, just with the lack of really just even mention of Christ, Jesus, but even more so, like Jesus doesn't really do anything apart from maybe being an example.
Right. I was going to say the two most common examples that I've experienced are one, when people say Jesus and God.
You actually said that in the last episode, but I left it in.
Okay.
You said God and Jesus.
Did I? There you go. See, even I do it. It's in the water, people. It's in the water. And the other one is when we preach Jesus as an example to live by, an example of godly obedience and piety, for example. The thing that is always left out, again, in my experience, is Jesus is God. You are incapable of imitating God. That's why Jesus has to do what Jesus does for us, because we are incapable of doing that. He even says what is impossible for men is possible for God.
But we bear the image of God.
Right.
Which means we can be gods, right?
Sure, absolutely. Give it a whirl. Write into us at BannedBooks.com.
Yeah. How's your being godly, how is that going?
So first then, for those of you who don't know, Arius was a Libyan, whose name is now used to refer to the 4th century controversy over Christ's divine sonship, otherwise known as the Arian controversy. He seems to have studied under Lucian of Antioch. He eventually became an Alexandrian priest over the Bacchalis region. He was excommunicated by the Bishop of Alexandria, whose name conveniently was Alexander, when a dispute erupted over the nature of Christ's relationship with the Father around 318 AD. Arius was condemned by an African council around 318, the decision of which was later re-examined and confirmed at another Alexandrian council in 323. So, Arius fled to Palestine with his followers. The supporters of Arius and of Alexander soon released a flurry of letters, both to inform and convince a wider audience. And soon the entire church of the Eastern Empire was informed and taking sides.
It's a battle.
Right. It wouldn't be a church meeting if there wasn't a battle.
And if there weren't sides.
It got to be sides.
It's got to be black
Arius
and white.
was condemned at the Council of Nicaea in 325 and banished to Illyricum. But Constantine soon invited Arius to be reconciled to the church, and the emperor ordered the Alexandrians to be reconciled with Arius. But the Alexandrian leaders refused. The exact chronology is not certain, but we know that Arius wandered around and was eventually judged orthodox by a synod in Palestine. Convenient that he lived in Palestine, and then a synod in Palestine decided he wasn't a heretic.
How many synods do we need?
Right. At some point, he wrote a letter which really angered Constantine, leading Constantine to order all of Arius's books to be burned. That may have been before or after his banishment. Athanasius continued refusing to admit Arius to communion. Eventually, Constantine decided to admit Arius into communion in Constantinople. But suddenly, Arius died the night before his readmission in 336.
That sounds suspicious.
I was going to say, either that's apocryphal and it just makes for good gossip. He died before he could take communion. Or he actually did die the night before he was to take communion, and there may have been some skullduggery afoot. Not that any pious, godly man would have his rival poisoned to death.
I could totally see Athanasius capitalizing on this. It's like, look, this is the judgment of God.
God, exactly.
Clearly.
And you can actually read this in Athanasius' account in his letter to Serapion concerning the death of Arius. But by the time of his death, Arius was only a minor figure in the quote-unquote Arian controversy. Others had been taking leading roles, perpetuating and magnifying the controversy for generations to come.
That's an important note. Sometimes, movements get somebody's name, but they take on a very different life.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, even really for us, like Lutheranism versus Luther, not exactly the same thing. Always.
Lutheranism is the history of the attempt to reverse justification by faith alone.
I know you've made that assertion from your teacher.
I have made that assertion from my teacher.
I think it's true that we would just put it this way: when you have an ism, it's not monolithic, right? So Arianism isn't just one idea, and it's not all purely Arius. We have another example of this, pietism in our tradition, right? And the pietists, the first ones, like Jacob Arndt, right? Jacob Arndt,
yeah,
Spener. You read them, and you're like, it's not so
bad,
right?
Yeah.
Not so bad, but things really get off the rails quickly. And maybe they're responsible for being the catalyst, if you want to put it that way.
Mm-hmm.
We were talking before we went on air, again, in our tradition, very narrow tradition, a big controversy in the 60s called Seminax. We don't have to go into it, but the guy who kind of started it all off backtracked pretty quickly, right towards the beginning.
He did.
But then, it was already out of control. The wheels were in motion. The fire had been started, however you want to put it. And even though he tried to distance himself from it, he was really responsible for at least bringing it to what was going on to other people's attention.
Right.
Yeah.
And most of these controversies don't just erupt out of nothing. They are a slow pot boiler that eventually blows the top off. And so it's not just theological, it's political. Sometimes it's very personal, and it gets all kind of thrown in that fondue pot of the theological controversy. So that makes it sometimes difficult to sort out what exactly.
Somebody has to be the fall guy, though, right?
Right. Someone's got to wear the black hat.
So Arius gets attached to it. It's kind of like the Athanasian Creed, not written by Athanasius, but got to put a big name on it so that it gets some authority, some legitimacy.
Exactly. And another note that I think is important, and I'll read this in a second, is that the reason that Arius was so popular is because he was essentially popular with the youth. He was a pastor who was very popular with the youth.
He was a hipster.
And he was a hipster pastor for his time and age, and he was a hymn writer. And he sent missionaries all over the place with his hymns and with his teachings. In fact, his teachings were spread popularly through his hymns, through his songs. This is why he was popular with the youth. He wrote catchy tunes, worship songs. He was, for lack of a better explanation, he was the contemporary worship pastor of his generation.
Yeah, he hacked it, definitely.
He did. The Arians were primarily responsible for evangelizing the northern Germanic tribes. And as I noted, somewhat humorously, if it wasn't for Arius and the Arians, there would be no Lutherans.
That is humorous. I think the other aspect here, when you were reading that summary bio, that there's a lot of political machinations in the background.
So, yes, so much so. In fact,
I mean, is he on our team? Is he not on our team? Can we bring him on our team?
Right.
It's not really doctrinal primarily. It's really just we don't, if you can't fight them, join them, that kind of thing. I think
I brought this up maybe in the Origin podcast, but what they would do politically is they would convene a council, and they would especially do it in a place like Ephesus or Palestine or Alexandria or Rome, wherever it might be. They would invite the people that they knew were allies first, and then they would delay sending the letters to their enemies, their opponents, so that by the time the opponents arrived at this synod, they had already voted and declared the people who arrived after the fact heretical.
So it's the pre-conference conference.
Right. So they'd show up and say, hey, what's going on? Oh, well, we already had the vote. We've been here for a week already. Where were you guys at? Well, we didn't get our letters until, and they're like, oh, really? You didn't get your letters? Must have been the mail. Must have got lost in the mail. Must have been a mix-up. Well, by the way, you're heretics.
And also then you're mentioning all these different synods, and especially in regards to Palestine, each of those centers of Christianity, if you like, in the 4th century, have actually different theological priorities.
Very much so.
And they're also politically not really allied. And I don't, was it on this show that we were talking about Alexandria was kind of, the redheaded stepchild,
right?
And not they were looked on with suspicion anyway. So the fact that Arius came out of that,
well, and then you have Augustine, who's also one of the North African bishops, and there was this there was contention between the North African churches and the churches of Rome, and then you have the Palestinian churches and their contention with the North African churches, and then there's a whole bunch of cultural things that go into that, and some prejudices actually between the Mediterranean, Near Eastern, and North African peoples, and a lot of tribal stuff that goes back literally thousands of years. There's all kinds of stuff in the mix.
Yeah, it's not always cut and dry doctrinal distinction.
Right.
It's
almost never, I would argue.
Yeah,
almost never.
Well, and then we'll probably talk about it, but the doctrine then ends up being used to indicate something that is really much more complicated, like the Great Schism, which is what 1054. Is that right? Between East and West. You know that it said, well, it's over the procession of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Not entirely. I mean, certainly that's the thing that was the put out in front of, for the optics of it all, is to say, hey, we're really
It was also a linguistic problem. The West spoke Latin and the East spoke Greek.
That's true too.
And words mean different things in different languages. And when you start talking about, especially when you start talking in Greek philosophical terms like homoousios and hypostatic unions, there's a lot that can get lost in translation. So in the West, without getting too deep in the weeds, in the West, it essentially created what's called monergism. Modalism, not monergism, modalism. And what modalism is essentially there's one God that wears three faces, three masks. So the Father is God, the Son is God, the Holy Spirit is God. But there's one God, and he ends up being described in such a way that he's wearing three different masks. So in the Old Testament, you have God the Father. In the New Testament, you have Jesus. And then Pentecost, you have the Holy Spirit. And the East accused the West of being modalistic. The West accused the East of having three gods and saying, well, there's three different gods. And the East is saying, no, we don't believe in three different gods. We believe in one God, but it's a perichoretic union. And the West said, we don't understand what a perichoretic union is. We call it this. And then, again, it just went back and forth until finally they went, you take your ball and go that way. We'll take our bat and go this way.
Yeah. Yeah, that's true.
So back to Arius then. Arius, for himself, wrote a book entitled Thalia, which means Songs of Joy. It's a collection of songs in which he sets forth his views, his doctrinal teachings. So this is very smart. We talked about this in the episodes on hymnody. If you really want people to digest and confess the doctrine that you teach, that you catechize or want to catechize, put it in the form of a song.
Especially a catchy one.
Especially a catchy song. Something with a good beat to it. So that's what Arius does. He basically puts together a hymn book called Songs of Joy, and he sets out his doctrine.
It's possible for a song to be, neutral, say pretty much nothing.
Yeah.
It's possible, but even, I suppose, even saying nothing is saying something.
Right. You're going backwards at that point.
Yeah, you're saying, I'm not going to make, it's like saying deeds, not creeds, right? Which is actually a creed.
Right, 100%.
Ironically.
So this expedient took well, for in the excited state of the parties, Arius's doctrinal songs were hummed everywhere. Alexander, on his part, likewise sent circular letters to the principal bishops that were around Alexandria. The controversy spread everywhere, and as it spread, it deepened. Quote, sailors, millers, and travelers sang the disputed doctrines at their occupations or on their journeys. Every corner, every alley of the city, this was said afterwards of Constantinople then, but must have been still more true of Alexandria, was full of these discussions. The streets, the marketplaces, the drapers, the money changers, the victualers. They ask a man, how many aboli? He answers by dogmatizing on generated and ungenerated being. Inquire about the price of bread, and you are told the Son is subordinate to the Father. Ask if the bath is ready, and you are told the Son arose out of nothing.
This reminds me of all the, for lack of a better word, the hippie psychedelic music of the 60s.
Right.
It's like, it's the dawning of the age of Aquarius. Like, what does that have to do with anything?
So basically, this is why Constantine convenes Nicaea in 325 to deal with this once and for all, he thinks.
Things are getting a little out of control.
But I just wanted to read that little excerpt because I think it's important for you to understand, especially you listening. Arius didn't just write some stuff down and then people read what he wrote and ran with it. That's not the way this works. It's not the way it works today. But rather, he wrote it and put it to song.
Right.
And through his songs, his teachings caught on, popularly speaking. And as it says here, no matter where you went, people were singing Arius' songs in church and in the public square and in the streets and alleys and as they went on their journeys.
This is exactly what we were talking about in our hymn episodes. Why we ought to be critical. Like I said, is it possible for the hymn to just be neutral? Well, that can actually undermine doctrine by saying nothing, right?
Trying to say nothing actually does go backwards because you're denying our confession of faith by trying to not confess the faith in a way that, quote unquote, offends people, let's say.
Yeah, so that speaking in generalities, or especially as we talked about in those episodes, like the refusal to give Christ credit for anything.
Sure.
Is implicitly just saying he doesn't need to be given credit for anything.
Well, here's a question, and I put it as a question to think about. If we in our churches strive not to, let's say, make people feel uncomfortable or offend people, we should then ask the other question, by attempting to not offend people, are we offending God? And should we not care more about whether or not we offend God by way of denying his son? This is my beloved son with whom I'm well pleased. Listen to him.
Yeah.
Should that not concern us primarily?
Well, and I think, I was thinking about this in regards to actually church website. Like, how much do you want to put on the website about what you believe? And it's really the same question. It's like, well, what if I say so much that people are like, whoa, those people really take doctrine seriously, and I don't want to go there.
Sure.
Well, that's actually true. We do. And or whatever it is, maybe there's some statement about baptism being, the exclusive way that God makes you his child.
Right.
And you're like, oh, exclusive only? By faith only? Or whatever it is. Is it going to offend? Yeah, of course it is, because Jesus offends. It offends our own sensibilities and, autonomy and all of those things.
I've come to put an axe to the root of the tree. So then, to Arius's Thalia, Thalia literally means abundance, good cheer, banquet, songs of joy. It was written in verse in order to aid memorization and popular distribution of Arius's ideas, technically his teachings. This is basically him catechizing people by way of song.
Yeah, like Luther did with the catechism hymns.
Yes, 100%. Fragments of this work survive in two writings of his opponent Athanasius. The first is in a report of Arius' teachings in Orations Against the Arians. This paraphrase has negative comments interspersed, so it is difficult to decide what are Arius' words and what are comments of Athanasius. The second is a more direct quotation on the councils of Arminium and Seleucia. Someone other than Athanasius, perhaps even someone sympathetic to Arius, may have compiled the quotations. So here are the quotations based on that translation.
Yeah, it's always a challenge. We were talking about this before we went on air, is trying to discuss someone only from the perspective of their opponent, rather than listen to their actual words. What did they actually say themselves? Right. And in the case of Arius, you pointed out to me, it's somewhat challenging since Constantine said, Constantine, who had a lot of authority in the world, to burn everything that Arius wrote. Athanasius
may or may not have punched somebody in the face during this argument.
Yeah, that's an anecdotal story. I love it, though.
Right.
Slap an Arian, yeah.
Yeah, so Athanasius was not a benign opponent of the Arians.
Right, and Arius had a lot of, not authority, but popular appeal, I think is how you'd put it.
Very popular appeal.
Yeah. And that's threatening to those in authority, because they want to retain power.
Well, it's threatening to those who are trying to stand up for orthodoxy.
Yeah.
It's, you stand up for orthodoxy, and if you read Athanasius' writings, he's not the easiest person to get along with. His personality does come through. He's definitely a very
aggressive,
hold the line, a very default aggressive human being. And so imagine, again, just compare that with what happens in the present tense. You have someone who is popular. The congregations, churches are singing his songs. People are singing his songs at home and in the streets and so forth. His missionaries are going out all over the place and evangelizing and building churches where there were none before. People are converting based on the teachings of Arius and the Arians. And here you are standing there saying, but he's not Orthodox. He's not, he's a heretic. He denies the Godhead of the Son. And people say, yeah, but his songs are so catchy, and he's such a nice guy, and his followers are they're such good preachers. They really inspire us and excite us.
And so there's two aspects to that. One, you mentioned God still uses it for the benefit of
right,
faithfulness.
Yeah, the Reformation essentially comes as a direct result.
Yeah, he works through an unfaithful man, presumably, even to bring about faithfulness to a whole nation, a whole group of people.
Sure.
So that's one aspect of it. The other aspect is, it's kind of a dangerous game to play that orthodoxy game. What is the essential confession? I do think, we do that. We have our creeds, and that's precisely what the creeds are to do, is like set a dividing line or thou shalt not pass. This.
Yeah, absolutely.
These are the boundaries of what it means to be faithful to God's word. And
excuse me.
Arius pushes that envelope too far, presumably, again, based off of what we've got here in the song we're going to look at.
So let's dive in then. And as we go, there will be some philosophical terms that are unavoidable, and we will not get bogged down in trying to explain them. You're free to look them up at your leisure or not. But as we discussed before we hit record, these are philosophical terms that are being used, and it's hard enough wrapping your brain around modern philosophy and medieval philosophy, let alone early Greek philosophical terms. We're so far removed from that context that when you start talking about substances and essences, for example, it's easy to lose the whole point to begin with. But these guys they're arguing at a very high level. Let's put it that way. So the fact that
it's like a literacy that they have that we don't even have, like a whole set of language and understanding and ways of seeing the world and themselves.
Well, and the fact that Arius was then able to summarize his teachings in song so that people could sing and understand them basically explains the intelligence of Arius.
Yeah. Some skill
let's go
here.
with it. So here's Thalia. So God himself, as he really is inexpressible to all. He alone has no equal. There is no one similar, and no one of the same glory. We call him unbegotten, in contrast to him who by nature is begotten. We praise him as without beginning, in contrast to him who has a beginning. We worship him as timeless, in contrast to him who in time has come to exist.
And by him who has beginning, who has come to exist and is begotten.
Right.
Are we talking about just humanity, or are we talking about...
Well, we're about to find out, aren't we? He who is without beginning made the Son a beginning of created things. So there's it. That the Son is a created thing.
The first creature.
He is the first creature, exactly. So that's where he goes off the rails.
Or the Nicene Creed, we say begotten, not made.
Exactly, and that's why we say begotten, not made. And now you know why. He produced him as a son for himself by begetting him.
Ooh, so there he's created, but he's also begotten.
Yep, simultaneously.
Ooh.
And that word begotten, I have looked it up in every dictionary I can find. I've looked it up in at least 4 or 5 different languages, and I still don't understand what the word begotten means.
It's not the same as being born, although
Right,
the Greek word we use both ways. It's interchangeable. It's the same.
That's what I'm
Greek
saying.
word.
That's why it's so hard for me to comprehend it with my little brain. Is it can mean born, but also mean not born.
Born in not born in a sense of coming, having some kind of relationship to, but not through natural birth.
Well, and just think about this very simply. If I say that Jesus is God, and God is unbegotten, God is just God, and there is nothing before God, there's just God. But then to say that Jesus is begotten of the Father before all worlds, well, which is it? Is he God and he's unbegotten, or is he not God and he is begotten? Is he created or uncreated? Which is it? Well, according to the fact that he's fully God and fully man, one could then make the argument both.
Yeah.
The problem is, like I said, you can get lost in the argument so fast.
Yeah, I know we said we'd avoid it, but it's right there.
It is. You can't avoid it. And I just think it's a good place to kind of jump into that water for a moment to just really express to you who are listening. It's not so much that we commit like full-on heresy, but rather we use words in a way that we think is helping express our confession of the faith better. But then after the fact, it turns out we're not really heretical in the official sense, but our language is heretical.
We're importing like philosophy or the language of philosophy to explain the unexplainable.
Right.
What God reveals, but doesn't reveal in a sense of, I don't know, full mechanical comprehension. We can understand how it all works. We just, it is.
Right. And to think of it, going back to the simplest analogy, to say Jesus and God isn't inherently wrong.
If by that you mean the Father and the Son, yeah.
Right. Therefore, say Father and Son. Don't say Jesus and God. Say Jesus and the Father, because that's the way Jesus talks, and that's the way the Bible talks. But is it bad to say Jesus and God? Not inherently. Is it confusing? Yes, especially to those outside the faith.
Because we confess that Jesus is God.
Right.
So why would you distinguish
in that way
between God and Jesus? Yeah, with an and, right?
So to continue then, God produced Jesus as a son for himself by begetting him. He, the Son, has none of the distinct characteristics of God's own being. For he is not equal to, nor is he of the same being as God. Now that seems a little bit clearer, I think, to the listener.
Yeah, even without the Greek terms, right?
Where Arius is wrong. Not only is he doesn't have the characteristics of God, but he's not equal to, or the same substance, the same homoousios as God.
This makes me wonder if Arius even had like John's Gospel.
Right?
It's like,
it makes you wonder.
Have you read? I mean, I think if you had the synoptics, yeah, there's still stuff in Matthew. I don't know how you could get to this.
Right. And for our listeners, we've said this in the past, but just to update, or for those of you who don't know, at this time, most people didn't have a complete Bible. In fact, almost nobody had a complete Bible.
Yeah, you might have one evangelist.
Right, and maybe the Psalms.
And maybe a few epistles.
Maybe in one of the books of Moses, maybe a couple prophets, a prophet. But it was very much mix and match, which again goes to the point of, if you're in Alexandria, maybe you have 5, 6, 11, 12 books of the Bible that the guy up there in Palestine doesn't have. Let's say you've got John, but he's got Mark. You've got Corinthians 1 and 2. He's got James.
So when did the what's called canonical, arguments come in as far as fixing the canon? That does come under Constantine. So it's around this time. I think
so. Look it up for me, please. Because I wanted to date it. I asked
you the question. You're supposed to know.
I wanted to date it later than that. I wanted to go much later as far as the official formulation of a canon, as far as the Bible being assembled and then distributed.
So the process was not yet complete at the time of the First Council of Nicaea in 325. So it's been a conversation since the 2nd century as to what books should be included.
And even in the 1500s and 1600s, they were still debating it.
So Constantine commissioned 50 complete copies of the Bible for the Church of Constantinople in 331, although there's no evidence to say what was in that official canon. So then there's Eusebius is the big guy, right?
Yes.
In his letter in 367, Athanasius, another guy we've been talking about, gave a list of exactly the same books that would formally become the New Testament canon.
Okay.
So there's an awareness of them. We're just saying they don't all have them.
Right, exactly.
How many codex? When are our codexes? Those are the complete, editions. There's basically 4 primary codexes. Alexandria was one, right? There was one in Rome.
Constantinople?
Was
there one coming in Constantinople?
Is the Rome one. And anyway, there's four primary ones from this period that we have. So it's really not until the 5th century that there's an agreement even about a book like Revelation.
So think about it. You don't have the internet. You don't have phones. You don't have mass transit. Therefore, you're essentially walking, sailing, or riding a horse where you needed to go. And most people never traveled further than 10 miles from where they were born in their whole life. So therefore, your access to the book, the whole canon of Scripture, the whole Bible, was entirely dependent just on where you were born most of the time.
Yeah. I mean, somebody like Constantine can afford to have one.
Yeah, right. He's the emperor.
Right. Like you could do the math. I mean, I don't know what it is at this point, but I know at the time of Jesus, like to own a copy of, say, Isaiah, like with the eunuch and Philip, it was probably in US dollars something like $2,000 just for that one book.
It was a huge deal. Right.
Yeah. So you had to be you had to be the Queen of Sheba.
Right. So you have the Son, who is not really possessed of any distinct characteristics that make God God, and he's not equal to or the same being as God. He's, as I've said before, the quick and dirty summary is Jesus is as close to God as a man can get without being God.
Because he's the first man.
Because he's the first man.
Even before Adam.
And thus, he is the prime example of how to live a godly life of obedience and faith. Because he's the first. So who better to set as your example than the first?
I think it seems quite reasonable.
Yeah, right.
Despite being contrary to Scripture, this is the kind of Jesus that we want.
Right. And to be clear, too, in the Greek world, unlike the Hebraic world or the Hebrew mind, you can't be two things at one time. You're either a man or you're a god, but you can't be both. And there's demigods, but they're
kind of a mixture.
Right. But as far as the Greek world is concerned, when these guys come out of Palestine saying Jesus is fully God and fully man, that is, he's 100% of two different persons, God and man. The Greek world goes, but that's not possible.
Right.
Explain it. And that's when you get the introduction of these terms.
And then we see that are spin out in our own tradition, like how can it be both bread and wine in Christ's body and blood?
Right, exactly.
Or how can you be 100% sinner and 100% saint?
Right.
At the same time, you can't be both things.
And as I've said before too, and I'll say it just to get you folks that were listening to think about this, if you say that Jesus is 100% God and 100% man, and yet deny that the bread and wine are also his body and blood, well, what's the difference?
That's the argument. Yeah.
So back to the poem, as unpoetic as this is. God is wise, for he himself is the teacher of wisdom. Sufficient proof that God is invisible to all. He is invisible both but to things which were made through the Son and also to the Son himself.
Huh.
Yeah, he definitely never had John's gospel.
So the Son doesn't even know the Father.
Right. Which is interesting because John says what? The Son has made him known to us because no one has seen the Father except the Son, who has made him known to us.
Right.
So John specifically says the only person who's seen the Father is the Son.
Well, there is some argument with John's gospel that of a later date, and that it's responding then in particular, to Gnostic, the Gnostic heresy, which Arius seems to have a little bit of Gnosticism going on.
I was going to say, yeah, he might be a fortunate son of Gnosticism.
Nothing new under the sun.
But yeah, so John's gospel, we got to throw that out because when Jesus says, if you've seen me, you have seen the Father, because I and the Father am one, Arius apparently didn't agree with that sentiment.
No.
Which, by the way, again, this is why I love reading this stuff. And for those of you who are listening, I hope this excites you to go read this stuff too, is when you read this stuff, then go back and read something like John's gospel and then really appreciate how explosive that gospel is, because the stuff that Arius is saying here, as we just noted, is the stuff that the Gnostics were saying at the time that John was running around in Ephesus, for example. So then read John's gospel in the present context and go, okay, if American Christianity is fundamentally Arian, that is, then Gnostic, the most explosive testimony to Jesus Christ that you could possibly unleash on your friends and family is just quoting John's gospel. And you'll get the same reaction that John's gospel got when he first published it.
Yeah, it's pretty mind-blowing. And even the part that we even skip over, what about 3 chapters, the high priestly prayer, because you just... it really undermines your
right.
It's like, what's going on? Because that's you just quoted it. So that's why I'm pointing that out. I and the Father are one.
So Arius continues, I will say specifically how the invisible is seen by the Son, by that power by which God is able to see, each according to his own measure. The Son can bear to see the Father as is determined. There is a triad, not equal in glories. So there you go. Father, Son, and Holy Spirit are not equal, and therefore are not glorified equally. Their beings are not mixed together amongst themselves. As far as their glories, one infinitely more glorious than the other. Meaning essentially, God the Father is the most glorious, infinitely glorious, whereas the Son and the Spirit are lesser than, not to be glorified equally.
Yeah, so the later confession... equal to the Father with respect to his divinity, less than the Father with respect to his humanity.
And here's the clincher then. The Father in his essence is a foreigner. He is a stranger to the Son because he exists without beginning.
Whew. Hey, kids, let's learn a song.
Apparently, they had a different musical tastes in the 300s. Understand that the monad eternally was, but the dyad was not before it came into existence. Monad 1, dyad 2.
And then triad 3. Okay.
And triad 3. It immediately follows that although the Son did not exist, the Father was still God. Hence, the Son, not being eternal, came into existence by the Father's will. He is the only begotten God. And this one is alien from all others. There may be a section omitted on the Holy Spirit that we don't have, so we skip ahead. Wisdom came to be wisdom by the will of the wise God. Hence, he is conceived in innumerable aspects. He is spirit, power, wisdom, God's glory, truth, image, and word. Understand that he is also conceived of as radiance and light. The one who is superior is able to beget one equal to the Son, but not someone more important or superior or greater. This is a very interesting
Or even equal, right?
Right. I was going to say this goes back to Islam, that Jesus is a prophet and Muhammad is a prophet. They are equal as far as the fact that they are prophets, and yet Muhammad, somewhat superior to Jesus.
Isn't that interesting?
Because direct revelation from God. But notice everything that we attribute to Jesus, wisdom, the power of God, the glory of God, he is the truth, he is the word of God, he is the light, so forth and so on. Arius here says, the one who is superior is able to beget one equal to the Son, which, at least if you just, to play devil's advocate, if I read this, I would think he's saying, I could be equal to the Son.
Mm-hmm.
You could be equal to the Son. Many could be equal to the Son.
Well, that's a strain of theology, even among Christians in the East, I mentioned it earlier, like becoming divine or becoming godly.
Right.
Rather than being declared holy or godly, if you like, through the Son. Rather, it's some kind of spiritual ascent.
Right. Progressive sanctification is what we call it.
Yeah, in a pejorative way, right?
Yes. That one becomes less human and more like Jesus.
So it's actually kind of comparable to, say, Buddhism, right? Where we're striving to be like the Buddha and to transcend our...
Right, become a bodhisattva. Yeah. Not someone more important or superior or greater. At God's will, the Son has the greatness and qualities that he has. Because of God's will, the Son has
not
greatness.
Because of who he is, but rather because it's given
God
to
wills
him.
it to be so. In this sense, Arius seems to be describing Jesus as being kind of a proxy, an adjutant for God.
Well, and it's similar to another heresy about the same time of adoptionism, right?
Yes.
Where there's this creature that God chooses of his own will and to adopt as his son and to then convey his godliness to. Like an avatar almost.
Yeah, right.
Okay.
His existence from when and from whom and from then are all from God. So Jesus exists because God allows it. And Jesus is great, and Jesus' qualities are great because God chooses for Jesus to be great. So to continue then, he, though strong God, praises in part his superior. Whew. In brief, God is inexpressible to the Son, for he is in himself what he is, that is indescribable. So that the Son does not comprehend any of these things or have the understanding to explain them. Wow.
So this isn't just, the way that we maybe approach young Jesus, where he grows in wisdom and stature before God and men.
Right.
But rather, Arius is saying he never does understand who he is.
The darkness did not comprehend the light.
Your example of him being a proxy or a puppet almost.
Mm-hmm. Well, like in John Wick 3, the adjutant. That the adjutant represents the high council. Jesus represents God's will.
Right.
But he is not God. Or at least not equal to God.
Speaking another's word.
Yes. What reasoning allows that he who is from the Father should comprehend and know his own parent? What reasoning allows that he who is from the Father should comprehend and know his own parent? For clearly that which has a beginning is not able to conceive of or grasp the existence of that which has no beginning. So essentially, because God is without beginning or end, how can something that has a beginning and an end comprehend that which is without beginning or end? How can the infinite comprehend the finite? Or vice versa, sorry.
Yeah, the other way around, right.
Finitum, capex, infinitum.
Non-infinitum.
Non-infinite, thank you.
Yeah. I'm still wondering, what's the benefit of this kind of teaching? Why was this as popular as it was? I mean, it does make sense, I think, to
Behavior
read.
modification, control.
So you too could be chosen, willed by God in the same way that he chose the Son.
Yes.
To be not superior to the Father, but to bear some of the attributes of the Father.
Right. If you look at Greco-Roman ideals of justice and righteousness, for example, earthly justice and earthly right, and even actually divine justice and righteousness, read mythology, Greco-Roman mythology. How does the hero in Greco-Roman mythology attain to paradise? Go watch the movie Gladiator, for example.
Yeah.
Perfect example. How does Maximus enter paradise? Through bravery, honesty, fortitude, courage, all these things, right?
Yeah,
he has
dreams
to prove
of the Elysian fields, right?
Right. He proves to the gods that he is worthy of the Elysian fields to be reunited with his wife and daughter. How in the movie or in the show Vikings does Ragnar Lothbrok get admitted into Valhalla? Same way. How does Cyrus the Great conceive of his entry into paradise? Same way. It's human nature to think in terms of quid pro quo, transactionally.
Right, yeah.
And therefore, in the Greco-Roman world, a guy like Arius is going to hear the good news of Jesus Christ and say, wait a minute, he died for the sins of the world. Yes. So all of the sins of the world are forgiven in the crucifixion, death, and resurrection of the Son? Yes. There's nothing that I need to do to merit or earn it? Yes. Well, that doesn't make any sense.
Because now what?
Yeah, exactly. It's always the now what that hangs us.
But pastor, for by grace you are saved by faith. So now what?
And these not of your own works, lest anyone boast.
But then he does talk works, but they're prepared for you from
beforehand to walk in.
Yeah,
right.
They're given to you as well. Oops.
Which is even more maddening, right? It's bad enough that he forgave me by grace alone, apart from my work, so that I am not able to boast. But just in case I wanted to ask that question, well, but now what? God cuts us off before we even take a step forward and goes, I already prepared your good works for you, which is mind-boggling because as I've talked about in relation to the pastoral office, apparently God already determined before he created me to be a husband and father of 5, to be a pastor, to train martial arts and be a martial arts instructor, et cetera, et cetera. Now, that's either deeply comforting or deeply troubling.
Yeah. I suppose you could think of them like, was it the original Men in Black where the space aliens are playing marbles with the universes?
Right, exactly.
It's like, are you just playing with me?
Right. Yeah. I forgot about that. Yeah, it's kind of funny that the clincher of that whole movie is that everything they went through was just so that they could play marbles. But it is. Ephesians in particular, but also Colossians. But Ephesians, since we brought it up, it'll really blow your fuses if you sit and think about it too much. Because Paul, from his reading of from the scriptures, the Old Testament as we call them, Paul reads the scriptures and somehow says this is all about Jesus and this is actually what they're trying to teach you.
The problem is that if God undermines the whole self-improvement project that Arius has and that we have today as well, and then the question becomes, now what? Well, it's also like, am I just like then a puppet, like Arius would confess of Jesus, that God just uses me however he will, and I have no collaboration, cooperation in that.
Right.
And that's not very comforting, I suppose.
Freeing.
It's like, I'm just a robot then?
Right. Well, this is the whole argument about free will. This is why most Christians will tell you, well, God gave us free will for a reason. And I'll actually explain, as I did at the conference last year, what does God's wrath feel like according to Romans chapter 1? Feels like free will.
Yeah. Doing what you want to do.
God giving you over to the cravings of your heart.
Which then ironically, when things don't go so well because of our bad choices usually,
right,
or others' choices that affect us, then we say, well, God has a reason or a purpose.
Right. Or what happened to my free will? It was taken away from me by these people or these things.
I can't control myself.
Right. Exactly. I had no choice. Or as I just brought this up again yesterday, someone once again asked, I see you on Instagram, and every time we meet, you seem more relaxed, more comforted. You seem really healthy and happy, and your family, blah, blah, blah. And I've been trying to change things in my life and turn things around and get on a different track. What do you do? And I explain it, and inevitably, 100% of the time, I'm told, that seems like a lot of work. Well, yeah, I didn't just put up a vision board and cut some stuff out of a magazine and then it just happened. I didn't read The Shack or The Promise or whichever thing is popular right now. And then all of a sudden it came true. It takes hard work, a lot of hard work, and a lot of failure if you want to be healthy. And so inevitably what I get as far as feedback is, one, it's hard work, and two, other people will just say, well, this is just the way I am. Or I guess I just have to accept this is the way it's going to be. Now, in one sense, evangelically, going back to our Ephesians reference, that can be a comfort.
Yeah.
That I'm set free from the burden of having to worry whether or not my vocation or vocations are God-pleasing or not. On the other hand, it can be very troubling if you're stuck in this kind of entropy that says, well, I just don't have any, I don't have any say, I don't have any control. As you said, I'm just a puppet. I'm just merrily, life is but a dream kind of attitude. But we get bogged down in these arguments because we just don't want to focus on Christ crucified for the forgiveness of my sins.
Yeah. And then how that works, how Christ himself works that in us, then love for one another, service, loving service.
And how he comes to us in the gifts, and how we reject the gifts and then say, well, it's not a big deal if we reject the gifts, so long as we all get along.
Yeah. So you'll hear this, and I've heard it too. Well, Pastor, that can't be it. There's got to be more.
Right.
There's got to be more. And I'm like, what else do you want? Well, you want autonomy. You want to contribute. You want to earn or favor. You want to become popular. I mean, whatever it is, you want all of these things that are not even needed.
Yes.
And not helpful, certainly.
And going back to earlier, when Constantine readmits Arius to communion, that is politically expedient as much as it's a theological decision, because Constantine wants peace in his empire. He wants peace.
Yeah, and that argument is used actually against the development of the canon, that this was Constantine canonizing and rejecting certain books because he's just trying to bring about some kind of political order.
Right.
And I wouldn't deny that that's actually part of it.
Right. Again, it's not that God can't work through our own machinations.
Right. I mean, Constantine wanted everybody on the same page. Actually, God does too.
So now, to wrap this all up with a little bit of time we have left, I'll read part of an edict against Arius and his followers written by Constantine Augustus. So the great and victorious Constantine Augustus to the bishops and laity. Since Arius is an imitator of the wicked and the ungodly, it is only right that he should suffer the same dishonor as they. Porphyry, who was hostile to anyone who feared God, composed a book which transgressed against our religion, and has found a suitable reward, namely, that he has been disgraced from that time onward. His reputation is completely terrible, and his ungodly writings have been destroyed. In the same way, it seems appropriate that Arius and those of like mind with Arius should, from now on, be called Porphyrians, so that their name is taken from those whose ways they have imitated. In addition, if any writing composed by Arius should be found, it should be handed over to the flames, so that not only will the wickedness of his teaching be obliterated, but nothing will be left, even to remind anyone of him. And hereby I make a public order, that if someone should be discovered to have hidden a writing composed by Arius, and not to have immediately brought it forward, and destroyed it by fire, his penalty shall be death. As soon as he is discovered in this offense, he shall be submitted for capital punishment. And in another hand, God will watch over you, beloved brothers. Peace out. I may have added that last part.
Yeah, I think so. So basically, we are not on. This is it was like a Chinese government, like Tiananmen Square never happened.
Right. Never happened. Yeah.
Like you're saying they tell their people that like it's all a fabrication of the Western media.
Yes, they do. Vietnam does that too, by the way. The Vietnamese government.
Do they?
They rewrote the history of Vietnam as far as like the prisoners of war during the Vietnam conflict.
So it's
and what actually happened.
So it's like 1984, more Brave New World, actually, right?
Yes.
Where you just rewrite history to your fashion. And
right. It's not that they didn't erase history. They just rewrote it.
Yeah.
Like the Venezuelan government, when they had an epidemic of child deaths, they just made a law that said doctors weren't allowed to report child deaths.
Oh, okay.
Problem solved.
So here, we're just going to destroy Arius. Well, unfortunately for Constantine, his edict didn't quite work out.
It didn't quite take.
It didn't quite take.
I just like the fact that he's like, we will kill you if you have any of his writings. But on the other hand, God will watch over you, beloved brothers.
Yeah. See ya.
Yeah. One sentence. Very evangelical.
Well, that's right. We want to let the gospel predominate here.
One would like a mention of Jesus. And I, as I noted before we went online, in a lot of these excerpts and these fragments, there's not actually any mention made by the Orthodox in regards to Jesus and the gospel either.
No.
It's condemnations of Arius' teachings, but then they won't bring up his teachings. And then they condemn his teachings, but then they don't confess the true faith. So this is why then going back to what we said earlier, you can see how the political overwhelms or overshadows the theological.
And but like we also said, God can still use that for the
absolutely.
sake of true faith.
Right. So that's it for Islam, John of Damascus' critique of Islam, also for our kind of delving into Arius. As I said, next week we'll come back and dive into Nestorius. And I hope, at least for myself, it's been super helpful to go back and review all this stuff.
Yeah.
It flushes out in the present tense then, as we talked about in relation to John's gospel and the Gnostics and Arius and so forth. Kind of helps you understand the stuff that we are confronted by in the church in the present tense is just the same stuff that the church has been confronted by in every generation. It just takes on a different name. It appears with a different face. Maybe it appears in song. Maybe it appears in writing. Maybe it appears in prayer, whatever it might be. However it takes shape, the fundamental teachings are the same.
I think it's more clever today. So you're not going to blatantly just say, well, Jesus isn't the Son of God. But you
sure.
are going to shift things and say, well, Jesus is primarily given to us as example, not as the one who dies for us for our forgiveness, but rather to show us the way we ought to go.
Yeah.
Right. So is he then? Yeah. So who is he exactly then? If he's not coming to die for the sins of the world, then what's his relationship to the Father? And you can see then where it's not exactly Arianism, but it's pretty close. Or
pretty close.
Consequences
Exactly.
The same. But much more subtle, and without the heavy philosophy and theological terms.
Essentially, it's Arianism for dummies. Then
it's like what do they call it? They call it prosperity gospel light, right?
Yes.
Joel Osteen. It's like it's not as obvious as the prosperity gospel preachers were, like his father. It's much more. It seems much more benign, but I think that actually makes it more dangerous.
Exactly, I would argue the same thing.
It's not as easy to define and to diagnose.
It's like eating Doritos. I know they're bad for me, but
are they?
They are they really? I mean, they're so delicious, and
they couldn't taste that good if they were
right. I don't really feel bad if I eat a whole bag. I mean, I'm just be honest.
Now, if you add a Hostess, cupcake to it,
that's disgusting.
And a Mountain Dew.
Wrong. And jeez, my teeth ache just hearing that. Oh,
sorry, listeners, if that's your snack
if that's
choice.
your jam, yeah. I got nothing else. You got anything?
No, it's good.
Awesome. So as we said in the last episode, if there's stuff you want us to read, and we definitely want to go in a more positive direction, we've been very hypercritical in kind of the past couple episodes.
Sorry, Arius. And Muhammad.
But if there's anything you want us to read, like we said, the authors, theologians that people have just basically tried to turn you off of and you've been positive about. I think we got an email about Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who I am intimately familiar with.
Yeah.
Having consumed and memorized much of what he wrote. We can definitely dive into Bonhoeffer. But we'll do that. And if you are so obliged, go pre-order my book, Crucifying Religion, available on Amazon.com. The number one new book in Lutheran Christianity. the book was not written actually for Lutherans. It was written for Christians in general. So don't take that as to turn you off or turn you away. It's definitely not a quote unquote Lutheran book, although a Lutheran wrote it. And therefore, if you've listened to this podcast, you know,
I can't help it. Nope.
I can't help myself. It's like I have kids. I can't help talking about my kids. Actually, I'd expect you to question my fidelity as a father and as a Lutheran if I didn't talk about all those things. But nonetheless, I would really appreciate it. And so far, like I said, it's #1 on Amazon. So that's crazy. Very humbling. Very humbling. Thank you for that. And we'll see you in an upcoming episode. Peace.